Tonight, the Department and Review Magazine, in collaboration with the Rifkin Center for the Humanities and the Arts at CCNY and the Consulate General of Spain in New York, are honored to present a conversation featuring renowned translator Edith Grossman and the Honorable Juan Jose Herrera, Consul for Cultural Affairs of Spain in New York. Edith Grossman is the award-winning translator of many major works of literature by Spanish and Latin American authors, among them of Miguel de Cervantes' masterpiece Don Quixote, of course, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera, Maria Vargas Llosa's The Feast of the Goat, and others by those authors, as well as by Luis de Góngora, Juan Inés de la Cruz, Carlos Fuentes, Mara Montero, and Alvaro Mutis, among many others. Juan Jose Herrera is a diplomat, author, art curator, and book editor, as well as a translator from French, English, and Italian, who specializes in Russian culture. He serves as Consul of Spain for Cultural Affairs in New York. And let's have a big hand for Edith Grossman and Consul Herrera of English.
Edith, the other day when I thought that I had to organize or think about it, think about our meeting today and our conversation, I realized that I hadn't really read any of your books.
Well, then I don't want to talk to you.
And I thought, she's not going to talk to me anymore. And then I immediately got hold of why translation matters. And then I discovered you. Somehow I discovered something of your personality, your way of being that is probably more intimate. Because there is a sort of not only, I wouldn't say that it is that book is a poetica, but it is almost a manifesto. It's a manifesto, and where you really describe translation or define translation as a search, and as a most intimate, a very deep search that entails, as you said it yourself, entails a vocation that calls to deep, resonating parts of our psyche. And then I realized that it is not that you wanted to be an activist and wanted to really fight for translators or for the rights of translators, that it is a debate that is very much on the table. And I think that you in America, especially in New York, you are very fortunate because you do have this debate on the table. This debate about which I would like you to sort of tell us about, no? Because it's today, for instance, I have read in the pages of the New York Review of Books an article by Tim Parks on the translation from Italian into English of the works by Primo Levi that was accomplished by quite a large group of translators, I think. And he was being really very, I don't know, he was really displaying the problematic of translation as well. And then he had made another piece of criticism that I liked especially very much about that book by Elliot Weinberger, 19 Ways of Translating One Way, the Chinese poet, which I must say that I have enjoyed both, the book by Elliot Weinberger and the text by Tim Parks. So I realized that, I mean, lots of readers, lots of people are really trying to discuss. It is a debate that is very much alive. No? And I was wondering, okay, this is something that I acknowledge in Edith as transcending, no, the pure his academic life, transcending his books, transcending his ideas. No, it's a path in life, I would say, no? And that search in your psyche, I thought that was really well worth seeing you again.
I'd better be careful what I write in the future. Well, I'm glad you think that there's enough conversation in the United States about translation, because one of the reasons I wrote Why Translation Matters is that it seemed to me that people were not saying what needed to be said. If I can go back a few years, there was a time when translators didn't get their names on the cover of the books they had translated. Translators were not acknowledged. They were, you know, the librarians in old Western movies and the elementary school teachers, they did everything for love and not for money, which is important. One must love what one does. But in our world, it's important to get money too so that you can live and continue to work. And so the lack of respect for translators, you were wrong. I was very exercised about it and very angry about it because it's a work that I love doing. And so I thought, well, I'll be very polite and I'll use polysyllabic words and not the four-letter words that I really wanted to use. But I'm going to write a book that, to my mind, tells the truth about the connection between the translator and the text, the translator and the author, the translator and the publisher, and the translator and the critics. Mm-hmm. Because you can read a lot of reviews these days of translated books, and there will be no mention of the translator at all. For decades, publishers did not want to put our names on the cover of books because they assumed that Americans did not buy translations. And so if they maybe pretended it was written originally in English, then people would buy it and not really care. So it was a hard struggle to get even minimal, that kind of minimal recognition, like your name somewhere on the cover, on the flyleaf, someplace, the title page, someplace to indicate to people that you had done the work, that you had rewritten the book, because that is what we do. We write the book a second time in another language. So I'll just continue with that for a minute. I always conceive of translation as hearing a voice and then speaking what I hear, but changing it into a second language. In other words, to do a translation, you have to hear what the author is saying. You have to hear the intention. You have to hear the difference between in a work of fiction, for example, the narration and the dialogue. And then you have to speak it in an English that matches up with the original. And this isn't a question of literal translation or anything of the sort. It's a question of knowing enough about the first and the second language so that you can find equivalences. And I'll just finish up this introductory remark by referring to our dear late Gregory Robasso. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you've all heard the anecdote that when he was translating 100 Years of Solitude, some fool asked him, a reporter, asked him if he knew enough Spanish to do the translation. And Gregory, who was a very smart and very courtly man, said, that's the wrong question. The only question is, do I know enough English? And that is food for at least one course in translation. Mm-hmm. if not more. How much English do you know? And how easily can, if you're translating into English, I'm going to keep talking about Spanish as the first language and English as the second. Do you know enough English to give the English-speaking reader the experience that the Spanish-speaking reader had? That's, that's what makes translation fun. It's what I enjoy, is that problem and how I go about solving it.
You enjoy translating at home?
Oh, I love working at home. Now, I used to work at City College. I taught here a few years ago, and I loved coming to NAC. I thought, what a weird name for a building that is, NAC. But I loved coming here. I loved my students. I enjoyed the class. But there is nothing I like better than staying in my sweatshirt and working at home.
And in those moments of solitude, working, don't you feel sometimes like a very sophisticated therapist whose patient is never there?
That's an image I'm going to have to think about. Let me ponder that. A therapist whose patient is never there. So that means I'm looking at the sofa and talking to nobody. Is that right?
Well, maybe to the pages of the book you are translating. Or the voice, that voice, because this little joke was related to that voice that you said it's so important to trace, discover, and get. You said some in one of your page, in the pages of the book, that Cervantes had a very clear voice, narrative voice, that you couldn't translate him quaint. You said, you used the word, that you had really to find the language had to be very, very clear, no? That he had a voice.
Well, it was the question, I remember this. The question is, and it's a really tough question, and I don't have a single answer for it, but the question is, what do you do? Let me backtrack for a minute. If you're translating someone contemporary from the 21st century, then you know what the tone of voice is, right? I mean, we live in a world that gets smaller and smaller, and we understand one another and levels of language. But to translate a language that's 400 years old, it's almost like a Monty Python skit. You can go into places that the original text has nothing to do with because of misunderstanding. But more important than that was the question of what voice do I use in English to translate a book that was written in the 17th century? Am I going to invent my version of Shakespeare? Am I going to use thee and thou and hast thou seen yon fair maid or whatever, and go off into some bizarre version of Baroque language? And I thought, no. What I say I think it's in the book, I had translated the work of a Spanish author named Julian Rios, and I had sent him a Christmas card or a New Year's greeting or something, and I said, Julian, estoy muriéndome de miedo. I'm scared to death at taking on Don Quixote. And he said, no tengas miedo. He said, don't be afraid. Cervantes is the most modern of us all. All you have to do is translate him the way you translate everybody else. And I said, wow, that's like as if he had a magic wand. That was a liberation. That was an emancipation. I said, that's right. Cervantes was so powerful and so avant-garde a writer when he was writing. He was creating a genre. He was creating a literary language. He created the novel. He was not writing quaint, picturesque, old-fashioned, charming, old-maid language. He was writing a really powerful, revolutionary language in many ways. And so I said, that's it. The one concession I'm making to the 17th century is that I'm not going to use contractions. So in the narration and when the educated characters speak, they never say don't, they say do not. They never say won't, they say will not. And I thought, this is a concession to the idea of formality that we have about the old days. But when uneducated characters speak, like our dear Sancho Panza, or the innkeepers, or the ladies of the night who are in the inns, they use contractions. It's a different level of discourse. Mm-hmm. So it was fun figuring that out. You know, it's like doing a huge crossword puzzle that somebody pays you to solve. All right, my voice went up. I'm bringing my voice down because that's the end of the sentence. Someone is paying me to solve. Punto final, period.
There are, I remember, and I think that you yourself say it somewhere, there are more than 20 translations of Don Quixote. And you always underline one that you liked especially, the one by Tobias Mallet.
I've never read it. I have never read it. I only know that people think very highly of the translation done in the 18th century by Tobias Smollett, who was a writer on his own. How do you say that? Smollett. Yeah, but no, he was a writer on his own. In his own right.
In his own
Thank
right.
you. See, I'm translating. You sit and you say, now how do you say that? So he was a writer in his own right in the 18th century in England, and he did a translation of Don Quixote that is very well thought of. But I read one translation of the Quixote back in the day when I was a high school student, and I was just learning Spanish, and I wasn't prepared to take on the novel itself. And I read a translation by Samuel Putnam. That had come out, I think, around 1950 or so, the late 40s, early 50s. And I read that, and then I never read another translation of it because I started, por mis pecados, I started to teach Don Quixote. And so I was reading it and rereading it in Spanish, not in English.
Not in English.
So I didn't read any other translation.
But let's go, if we go back to that room where you are on your own translating, that sort of laboratory.
Talking to that absent
cabinet.
patient.
That it sounds like the place where a magician sort of concocts a potion or something. But that voice that you depict so well in your book, that voice of the author, you know, that if you don't see it, you'd better not translate the book because you are not getting to it. You know? And
I've said that you really ought to love what you translate because you are living intimately with that book for a long time. And imagine living intimately with somebody you can't stand.
exactly, exactly.
So it's best to love the author, to have a feeling about the author. The feeling I've had about Cervantes, poor Cervantes with his 6 remaining teeth. You know that self-description? That his beard used to be blonde, but now it was gray. And he had 6 teeth left in his mouth, not well placed. So it broke my heart. It just broke my heart. He was a man I would have loved to have a drink with. I would have loved to go out with Cervantes and hang out with him for a few hours and talk to him and listen to those stories. Listen to those endless stories that he had to tell. War stories. War stories. Prisoner of war stories. You know, he was in the Algerian prisons for 5 years. And the Algerians had very severe punishments for people who tried to escape, like cutting off everything on your face that stood out, like your nose, your lips, your ears, your fingers, your toes. He never stopped trying to escape, and he never stopped going up to them and saying, I was the one who organized it. And they never did anything to him. And I've always wondered, they must have thought he was a sacred idiot. That this is the kind of person you cannot touch because the wrath of God will come down on you for hurting someone so naive and so brave. Anyway, I'm sorry.
No. It is the story of Los Baños de Argel. It's that moment in which baño doesn't mean a bathroom,
Right.
but a prison,
Right.
in Spanish. Yes, but I think that you mention as well Octavio Paz in your book, when he says, and this, what you say that why you try or you would like to meet Cervantes, that's why I said before, you're a therapist, not a therapist, but maybe you are sort of trying to make some magic there. And because it's not only translating words. A translator goes further than that. You have to translate a whole new world, and you have to perceive it through many different sensors. And that is an experience that has to be put together with the real fact that you are translating a book. And I remember that in your book, you mentioned that beautiful sentence by Octavio Paz that says, when we learn to speak, we are already learning how to translate. So it's that big translation of the world that I was sort of trying to take you to.
Yeah, that's an amazing statement. That learning to speak is learning to translate, which is what a child does. There's all of the sensory material and data around the child, and slowly she or he has to learn the words, what you call all of that. What do you call this thing that comes up to your face every time you move your arm? Mm-hmm. What do you call this thing that you put your hand down on? What do you call the person who picks you up and makes you feel better when you're sad? So that was very profound of Octavio Paz, I think, very profound. I'm sorry, I got lost in...
I was very happy to read that, because actually you said something, and I'm going to repeat it for all of you. And she says literally, and here I mean translation not as the weary journeyman of the publishing world, but as a living bridge between two realms of discourse, two realms of experience, and two sets of readers.
Two sets of readers.
Of readers.
Did I say that?
You wrote it. You wrote it. Here I am to remind you of it. And I was very moved then when I read those pages in your book, because I have been a translator myself. Nothing comparable to your profession, to your trajectory, because I've never been a professional translator, and I've never dealt with literature. I've translated essays, books on anthropology, mythology, but I always, and when I read as well Walter Benjamin's book on translation as well, his wonderful essay on translation, I think one of the most beautiful ones.
I think it's called On Translation,
On
isn't
Translation.
it? Yeah.
On Translation.
Yeah.
When I read it, I realized that translators, and you described that role of a translator in your book, A translator, I mean, is essential, is crucial in the development of our societies. I mean, as a diplomat myself, I'm translating all the time, and I am being translated all the time. Translation is essential. And it's not only translation of texts, no? It's presence, gestures, so many things that we are constantly translating in this process of knowledge. You know? And so I thought it was a beautiful acknowledgement of that depth, of that world that you want to claim for translating. No? It is a field that academically I see in your book that you are not happy at all about how academy considers translation and translators.
Well, that's changing slightly. I mean, there was a
Happy to hear
time.
that.
There was a time when, if you were a serious translator, promotion and tenure committees in universities did not consider the translations publications. But in the past 5 to 10 years, I think, I can't date it exactly, more and more universities have programs in translation. So this may be the end of translation. Once it becomes respectable, it's finished. But I think translation has become respectable, academically respectable, and there are more and more serious programs to train young translators. Though I do think the best thing you can do if you're interested in translating is just jump into it. Gregory Rabassa used to say, I have taught at least 10,000 workshops in translation, and I never teach translation. All I teach is editing. And so learning how to revise what you write and then revise it again and revise it again, revise it again. It's a wonderful way to start to feel the nuances of your own language, of the language you're translating into. There are some miraculous people who can translate into languages that are not their native language. And I find them incredible. Because it seems to me, I've always felt you have to translate into the language of your unconscious mind. You have to translate into the language you dream in. You have to translate into the language that you know so well, it's not even a matter of knowing it. You just feel it. It's in your blood. It's in your bones. It's the way you eat, the way you laugh, the way you walk down the street.
Yes.
Okay, my voice has gone down. That's the end of that sentence.
And then with all that sort of complex translation of so many things, so many data, you create a style of your own that, are you aware that that is an influence as well, or might be, well, an influence upon other English writers? I mean, writers who write in English. You mentioned that in your book, and I thought it was one of the most fascinating chapters. For instance, when you mentioned the influence of Faulkner in Latin American writers through the Spanish translations.
Somebody once
Obviously.
called Faulkner the best-known Latin American writer in English.
Exactly.
There is a connection between Faulkner and Latin America that's really interesting. And Faulkner was a great fan of Cervantes. He said he read Don Quixote once a year. Well, he may have been exaggerating. Maybe he read it every 5 years. But he apparently had 3 or 4 copies of Quixote in translation in his library. And he also had little figurines of Quixote, and I think he had a bust of Cervantes. And so Faulkner was the author very close, who was in touch with something Hispanic. And it may be because the southern United States is really close in many ways to Latin America. You know, that some people said Latin America should stop at Virginia. There is such a similarity between our South and the southern hemisphere, you know, the southern South America, Central America, the Caribbean. Very similar.
And there is now there goes a different sort of question, Edith. Do you think that Spanish is still an exotic language vis-a-vis of the English language?
Exotic? No. Are you kidding? It's not exotic. First of all, every second person you meet in New York is a Spanish speaker. Secondly, that word, talking about exotic languages, is only what certain editors do, because most editors know only European languages. They don't know Asian languages, and they don't know African languages. And of the European languages, they know maybe Spanish, maybe French, maybe a little German, a touch of Russian, and that's it. So anything that isn't one of those, maybe Italian, maybe a little Italian. Any other language they call exotic. But that is such an imperialistic term to use about a language. It's not exotic to all the millions of people who speak it, right? It's exotic only to those of us who don't know it.
Yes, of course. That was a question.
You wanted to see me get excited.
Yes, I asked you because you mentioned that expression in your book, no, exotic languages, and I know very well that, and we all know that exoticism in this case depends basically on power, on politics, on imperialism. You mentioned, as it can be as well said about Spanish. We can go backwards in time, no?
No, listen, give anybody any country a little bit of power and they'll turn into a monster.
Yes.
It's the history of the world. And then when they lose the power, they become pacifist and kind.
Yes, yes. And then I wanted to compare English with Spanish because obviously you have started translating Cervantes late in your life, or late in your career, after having translated so many Latin American authors, no? And some of them incredibly important, no? Already in the history of literature. And one thinks, in the end, you are translating Cervantes into a language that in 17th century Europe mirrored that of Cervantes. Because, I mean, figures like Shakespeare or Cervantes do not pop up like that every year. And theater, maybe Cervantes, of course, he was a novelist, the first proper novelist. But these two worlds could be enjoyed by, I'm sure that it could have been enjoyed by the different audiences, no? The English audience or the Spanish audience. The Golden Age literature has something in common, not only in Spain, in Britain too. And then I was realizing that maybe English is the best of the languages to translate Cervantes into.
Well, in many ways, it's the best of the languages because we never had an academy of the language. Many European languages were cursed with an academy that said, oh, no, you can't use that word. Oh, no, we don't say that in Portuguese. Oh, no, that isn't Spanish. No, the French they're still doing it. The French are impossible. But English never had an academy. So English was there with its arms wide open. They said, oh, good, you have some Native American words, we'll take them. African, we'll take them. Asian, we'll take them. Absolutely, absolutely.
I completely agree.
It's why English is such a huge language. We have a lexicon that's grotesquely large compared to other European languages.
I completely agree. I think that it's true that there is no an academy of the language, of the English language, but there is one of the most formidable dictionaries.
Oxford,
The
OED?
big, the encyclopedia, the encyclopedic format, which is extraordinary. But it is true that it is more porous. It allows the language to be more porous because a language is a being.
Unless you try to build a wall around it. And then you're in trouble.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry, I couldn't help that. The election's tomorrow, right?
But then you said, and I like that anybody who writes in Spanish has Cervantes in the back of his mind.
I think so. I think every serious writer in Spanish has absorbed Cervantes. And one of the points I made in that book was that we don't have a model like Cervantes in English, not for prose. There isn't any figure, I mean, we have Shakespeare, who certainly looms very large in poetry and in the theater, but not in fiction. We don't have a figure like Cervantes.
Because Shakespeare never wrote in prose.
If he had written novels, we would have Shakespeare, but he didn't. But he didn't.
Yes, yes. And still, it's beautiful to think that translation is a utopian, always utopian, but at the same time alive.
You know what Cervantes said about translation. He said reading a translation is like looking at a tapestry from the wrong side. It's in Don Quixote. You see all the knots and
All the
stitches
knots.
and things.
And I think, yes, we've mentioned reviewers, publishers, the market, the ignorance of many people that do not even give enough credit to translation, or even that want to erase any credit whatsoever that might have been given to translation. The control of the academies.
Well, that's okay. We're in the
What
academy
else?
now. Be careful what you say.
I know, but I can take some liberties.
I spent the best years of my life in the academy, so
Yes, yes. And isn't it the fact that you became a translator? Isn't it a sort of an elegantly rebellious side of your character?
I don't know how to answer that. I became a translator by accident. By accident. I'll tell you the story since you're all sitting there and standing there with bated breath. An old friend of mine was editor of Review magazine before Dan had took it over. His name was Ronald Christ, and Ronald asked me back in the Middle Ages, it must have been 1970, 69, 70, and he asked me to translate a piece for Review. And I said, Ronald, come on, I'm not a translator, I'm a critic. He said, call yourself whatever the hell you want, just do it, just translate it. So I did. And I thought, this is brilliant. I'm home in my sweatshirt, right? I don't have to get dressed. I don't have to go to work. I used to smoke in the bad old days. I can smoke as much as I want to, and I don't have to run out of the library every 45 minutes to have a cigarette. So I thought, this is nice. This is something I could really get to love. Fortunately, the piece he gave me was a story by the most eccentric writer who has ever lived, an Argentine named Macedonio Fernandez. Do you all know him?
Yeah.
He was of the generation of Borges' father. He was a generation older than Borges. And his life was very eccentric. I mean, he truly was what we used to call an odd duck. But his writing was stunningly original, and his stories were really a kind of almost science fiction in the degree of imagination that he brought to them. So the piece I translated was called The Surgery of Psychic Removal. And it had to do with someone who perfected a technique whereby 8 minutes of your memory could be removed. And it goes on from there. I mean, it's truly a bizarre story. And I had so much fun working on it. I mean, I liked the story so much, being an old science fiction fan, that I thought, this is great, especially working at home and smoking myself to death. That's absolutely terrific.
And well, I think time is running out.
Oh, no more anecdotes of my life?
But, and then I would like to thank you very much for your generosity.
Oh,
And
thank
for
you for
your-
the questions.
Yes, your humor, your communication of those secrets, no, of the sanctum sanctorum of translation. Yes, there is something that I liked a lot and touched me especially as well. You said that translators live schizophrenically because their loyalties go into two directions: the original language and the language you are translating into. And then you say that you solved that problem of loyalty, making the translation as quirky as it is. And I love that because then you say, and then
I don't remember.
by doing that, you will be criticized because critics won't understand.
Did I really say that? That's terrific. Oh, I'm glad I said it.
And have you been criticized? Just my last question. Do you remember harsh criticism or not harsh?
No, but you must understand that the harshest criticism of all is not having a review.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of books were published and there was no harsh criticism because nobody was talking about them. I would have relished some negative reviews to get a review for some of the books.
Yes, I understand. I understand, of course. Edith, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.